Welcome, everyone, and good morning. We are so pleased that you are able to join us, both our virtual audience and our in-person folks here. And we are just thrilled to be able to welcome the Right Honorable David Lammy, a longtime partner to CAP and to CAP's efforts on democracy, on economy, on climate, on public safety, and on justice, and much more. Mr. Lammy, we are privileged to host you here today. We look forward to better understanding what you see as the top priority challenges that our world faces, and how you assess the nexus between the global and regional and local impacts and solutions that are before us. Former House Speaker Tip O'Neill, who hailed from my home state of Massachusetts, often said all politics is local. And perhaps you'll give us a transatlantic take on his accuracy on that point. We especially look forward to hearing from you on the role that government plays or should play in driving positive change, and on what those of us outside of government can and should do to help. CAP, as you know, has long been focused on doing our part to change the world and the country for the better in crafting a foundational message for the start of a welcome new administration. In January 2021, CAP released a More Perfect Union paper that called for rewiring the economy, rebuilding the social safety net, and reconnecting America with the world. CAP is pleased to see that 2 years on, we have seen just how much President Biden and his team, with help from the last Congress, have built on this foundation, with legislation including the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, and more. The combination of these pieces of legislation add up to more than $1.5 trillion in federal investments that will incentivize significantly more private sector funding and lead to good, clean energy jobs, increased and more equitable educational opportunities, significant progress on tackling climate challenges. And these investments will allow America, alongside like-minded partners, to compete more effectively in the world. And it is a world rife with challenges, none more important than keeping democracies and democracy safe and secure, and holding bad actors accountable, whether autocrats such as President Putin in his vicious invasion of a democratic Ukraine, corrupt oligarchs, and kleptocrats who exploit the financial systems in too many of our democracies, organized criminals, terrorists of all stripes and types. Like-minded leaders coming together with shared approaches and shared objectives can increase exponentially the ability to make positive change. Mr. Lammy, you are such a leader, and you are bringing exceptional experience, vision, and influence to your current role as Labor's Shadow Foreign Secretary. You have served you serve as a member of Parliament for Tottenham since 2000, and Tottenham itself illustrates the global nature of what local politics means. You also were Labor's Shadow Justice Secretary, and previously under Prime Minister Gordon Brown, you served as a Minister of Higher Education, and under Prime Minister Tony Blair, you were Minister of Culture, and you've been a member of the Privy Council since 2008. I cannot imagine a more important time for all of us to hear from you, the Right Honorable David Lammy. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you so much. And, you know, it's a strange thing to have arrived in UK politics back in the year 2000. And people used to describe me as the young Denzel Washington of Westminster. And 23 years later, to be here as the much older Forrest Whitaker of the UK system. But over those years, whilst the Labour Party has been in power under Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown, visiting the Centre for American Progress, and also whilst we have been out of power for the last 13 years, I just treasure the friendships and the relationships that I and other colleagues have forged, and the opportunity to be here. So thank you so much to the Centre for American Progress for hosting me here today. Of course, I'm speaking as the United Kingdom's Labour Party's shadow foreign secretary. But my first job is to represent an area of North London called Tottenham. Some of you may know it has the best football team in the United Kingdom, but it's also one of the most diverse constituencies, not only in Britain, but in the world, a place where more than 200 first languages are spoken, where the outside world is fundamentally local, and where the foreign and domestic converged many, many decades ago. As a boy, growing up in my constituency, I was lucky to be taught early about the linked nature of the United Kingdom and the United States. I spent long, hot summers with cousins in Brooklyn, New York, a neighborhood separated from my home by 3,448 miles, but where inner city life for a young child growing up in Tottenham or Brooklyn felt pretty much the same. Later, I got my first international work experience as a young would-be lawyer with Black role models who worked in the legal team at Con Edison in Manhattan. And that gave me the confidence and the determination to win a place at Harvard Law School. And there I saw the strength of our two nations is not defined simply by what happens within our two countries, but how we work together. And one of my greatest political friendships is with former President Barack Obama, for which I am truly, truly grateful. A friendship that goes back the days before he became president, when I remember having conversations about what it was like to be in government, because President Bush was leading the United States. I was a minister under Tony Blair, and we'd have very rich conversations about what that felt like. And then, of course, we lost power, and his period in government, I think, is exemplary. Today, as the traditional boundaries between foreign and domestic policy have broken down further, the need for the United States and the United Kingdom to work together as an alliance of progressives has never been stronger. The domestic policy choices made here in Washington, D.C., from the Inflation Reduction Act to the CHIPS Act, have profound effect in a constituency like mine back in the UK. Just as our two nations' foreign policy choices, from our relationships with allies like the European Union and competitors like China, will have more impact on the lives of working people in each of our countries than they ever did before. There is an opportunity for a progressive moment if Labour are able to govern in my country with an ideal partner in Joe Biden. We must take the opportunity to seize this potential for a progressive moment, with our shared outlook on foreign and domestic policy having merged. Not just repeating the familiar rhetoric about a special relationship, but forming a renewed partnership for progressive change on the world stage. This is a new era, but its implications should not surprise you. The United Kingdom's future has always been brighter when the United States succeeds, just as the United States is stronger when it has a reliable, forward-looking, and dynamic ally in the United Kingdom. We can see from our shared history how effective this partnership can be. In 1998, Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair and Democratic President Bill Clinton helped forge the Good Friday Agreement and deliver peace in Northern Ireland. I take no pleasure in saying this, but those in DC who pay attention to what's happening in Westminster will already have noticed. For the past 13 years, the UK government have taken our relationships with the United States and our allies for granted, damaging the UK's standing in the process, leaving the European Union without finding a new, settled, and confident place in the United Kingdom, eroding our country's reputation for upholding the rule of law, squandering our leadership in international development, weakening the foundations of our collective defenses, and forsaking our climate leadership. The next government will inherit the consequences of these choices, and it could fall to us to reconnect with our allies. Today, I want to deliver a message to you here in Washington and to the whole of the United States. The UK will return to the world stage. We hope to create a Britain reconnected, defining Britain's foreign policy around 5 clear goals. First, a Britain reconnected to defend the UK's security as NATO's leading European power. Second, a Britain reconnected to champion the UK's prosperity, working closely with our allies to lead the industries of the future. Third, a Britain reconnected for climate action, turning our response into an engine of growth. Fourth, a Britain reconnected for international development, helping to promote the UK's security by reducing conflict, poverty, and suffering around the world. And fifth, a Britain reconnected for diplomacy, to re-establish the UK as a trusted, reliable, and influential partner that keeps to its word. And today I want to focus on 3 ways these goals can serve both the domestic and foreign interests of Britain and the United States. Last February, a few months before Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I visited Kyiv. Standing in the capital then, I could never have predicted the scale of the destruction its people would have to endure over the past year. From the beginning of the crisis, Labour has stood shoulder to shoulder with the government and the international coalition supporting Ukraine's freedom on providing the military, economic, diplomatic, and humanitarian assistance it needs to win. Whoever is in government, the UK will stand with Ukraine. And we thank our friends in the United States for being instrumental in providing tens of billions of dollars in support. Long may it continue. It was a Labour Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, who was the driving force behind the creation of NATO 70 years ago. Today, as then, our commitment to NATO is unshakable, but we recognize that with worrying developments in the Indo-Pacific, Europe must develop more capacity to defend itself as well. And that's why we will pursue a new UK-EU security pact to complement our NATO ties. By strengthening European security, we enhance the capacity of the whole of the NATO alliance, freeing more of the United States' capacity to address challenges elsewhere in a very divided world. And just as a more secure Europe will lead to a more secure United States, a more prosperous Britain will be a stronger ally. As we shift away from fossil fuels in our race to net zero, we will increasingly rely on critical materials such as cobalt and lithium. The United States CHIPS legislation recognizes this with its $52 billion in subsidies for US chip manufacturers. as does, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act legislation worth 500 billion US dollars in new spending and tax breaks. But without action, Britain risks falling behind. It's a monumental oversight that so far the United Kingdom has responded by allocating just £700,000 for a research project. No clear industrial strategy to clear our path to the green transition. We need a different vision. Ours, like our friends in the Democratic Party, is for a green prosperity plan, delivering zero carbon electricity by 2030, quadrupling offshore wind, tripling solar, doubling onshore wind by the end of this decade, while backing nuclear, hydrogen, and tidal power, supporting the creation of over 1 million jobs over the next decade. But unlike the United States, which has the potential to develop something close to self-reliance in green technology and materials, the United Kingdom cannot do this on its own. We need to work with the United States to secure our future. And conversations happening between the United States and the EU on subsidy exemptions, it would be a mistake to leave out the UK. The United States is strengthened by a strong and prosperous Britain. And that's why if access is made in America, subsidies program created under the Inflation Reduction Act is granted to the European Union, it's in the United States' interest to grant it to the United Kingdom as well. Meanwhile, abroad, we will seek a clean power alliance, an inverse OPEC of developed and developing nations committed to 100% clean power by 2030. Our answer, John Kerry's climate diplomacy. And third, in a new age of hybrid threats and weaponized interdependence, where the drivers of what binds us together in a globalized world, trade, energy, migration, and new technologies, are being used as levers to exert the power of nation states, we must do more to work together to tackle them. Dirty money from Russia and other authoritarian states that has been infiltrating London for more than a decade. Money laundering has seen London homes become the bitcoins of kleptocrats, pricing out frontline workers from their homes, leading to corruption, bribery, and even the financing of terrorist organizations. I'm proud to back Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Jean Shaheen's calls for a new Transatlantic Anti-Corruption Council to establish to coordinate the fight against corruption. But we want to go further by inviting all foreign ministers from the Five Eyes, the European Union, and the US to London to develop a common strategy and platform to coordinate the fight against kleptocracy, creating interagency and international working groups, clear deliverables, cleaning up the London laundromat, and defeating kleptocracy around the world. A perfect example of where foreign and domestic politics meets. Strengthening cooperation with the United States must be one of the UK's top priorities, working together to seize a moment of genuine progressive change, to advance both of our nation's security and prosperity, and a progressive transatlantic moment in 2024 can form the core of a broader coalition. In 2024, all Five Eyes countries, as well as partners like Germany and France, could be run by center, left, or liberal governments. A progressive United Kingdom government will seek to be at its center, creating a Britain reconnected, once again, a confident country outside of the European Union, but as a leader in Europe, working with the United States as NATO's leading European power, a development superpower tackling the same challenges USID, taking action against the climate crisis, driving forward the industries of the future, a country that keeps to its word and the rule of law, a reliable partner once again, and a dependable ally. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lammy, for those comments. I'm so excited that we have the opportunity to be able to talk through them a little bit more. Some questions for you, and then we will take questions as well from our audience. So again, so glad to have you here. I wonder if we might start with talking a little bit more about Ukraine. You visited the UK, has been a staunch and early supporter of President Zelensky, and then working together, obviously, with the United States and others to supply Ukrainians with what they need, both military and non-military support. What do you see? What are you seeing and hearing among British communities about the sustainability of the support that, as you pointed out, is very much necessary? But what are you hearing at home in your home constituencies, and what do you think we need to do, you in the UK, we in the US, to fortify the support of our people for this action?
Well, thank you very much for the question. You know, it's extraordinary, but it's perhaps the case that because of the unique role that the United Kingdom played in the Second World War, historically, the UK is a country that has not been invaded since 1066. There is a cross-party support, and there is tremendous support amongst the British public for this fight. People recognize the imperialism in Vladimir Putin's eyes. They felt deeply compassionate to the Ukrainian women, mainly, and children rushing out of the country into Poland and then seeking to find homes, some staying in Poland, but many moving across the European Union and some into the United Kingdom. So notwithstanding the cost of living crisis that we're experiencing in the UK, the rise in energy prices, in goods in the supermarket, in petrol, there remains solid support in the British public. When Vladimir Zelensky visited Westminster and came and addressed our parliament, it was very important that all political parties were there. He met with all of us. And just as now, you recognize we've had quite a few prime ministers in the last few years. So just as Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak have visited Kyiv to meet with Mr. Zelensky, it's also the case that Keir Starmer, as leader of the opposition, has gone to be absolutely clear in our solid support. We're having this conversation at a critical moment for the country as this spring offensive begins. I am fortunate in our system as a privy councillor, we call it, to the privy being this small group of people that would gather around the king or the queen.
Important translation for American.
That is the translation. So that means that I can have intelligence briefings in confidence, so that I'm up to speed with where we are, despite being in the opposition. It's a very good system. It works very well. I had a briefing just a few days ago in our Ministry of Defence, and this spring offensive is very important. It's why the conversations that we've had across allies on tanks, particularly, but then also on fighter jets, has been so critically important, so that we can make sure that Ukraine remains in the strong position when inevitably we will get, I hope, to the peace. So thank you very much for the question.
I'm going to actually ask a follow-up on that because I am curious about from where you sit, hearing about the strong support, unified support of the British people. Is there any sense of what is your reaction and what is the British leaders writ large and reflecting the British people sense of where the United States is? I know you had conversations with government officials, but in terms of the United States.
I was very pleased to be at the Munich Security Conference and to meet with people like Nancy Pelosi and Senator Shaheen and others that were there, but also to see Mitch McConnell and, to see a cross-party support for the war in Ukraine. We've just got to be really clear-eyed about the consequences and the misstep that we would be making as a Western alliance if we were ever to allow those who might interpret this conflict as sort of regional. And a little bit of changing hands of territory. Victory for Putin would not end at Ukraine. Be absolutely clear about that. If you're in a Baltic nation like Estonia, Latvia, Poland, this is a deeply, deeply worrying time. And our way of life, the global order that we worked together to set up after the Second World War, and as imperfect as it is, the international system of the United Nations, for example, our World Trade Order, our World Health Order, we worked together to set that up. The human rights architecture that we have as Britain moved away from empire and the United States assisted us with that journey, all of that would be squandered if we allowed Vladimir Putin to get his way. And so it's hugely important that we continue to stand with Ukraine. And let me just say this final thing, be under no doubt that just as Putin saw our two countries and others leaving Afghanistan, and I don't think that was the highest moment of the Western Alliance, and took his moment.
It's very diplomatically put, by the way.
Took his moment in Ukraine. He knows that there is an election in the United Kingdom. He knows that there's an election in the US in 2024. And so he might be thinking, I just got to get through 2023, and these democratic nations will lose their attention. They'll become very self-absorbed. There'll be a debate in the United States. We should pull out of Ukraine. Let's not spend as much money. And then I win. Do not let him do that. And do not let those who might make that argument here in the United States succeed.
Thank you. We will keep those words close at heart and in the forefront of how we at CAP are looking at these issues. So really appreciate that. I want to ask you a little bit about the UK EU or the UK European relationship. I realize those are two different things. Unquestionably, the UK has played a critical role in NATO, as you pointed out. You've also had some rough waters with the EU post-Brexit. Curious about how you're seeing the relationship now, and a little bit of how you see it vis-a-vis the relationship with the United States as well.
Well, clearly it will not surprise this audience that the rancor and the division that has been present both within the United Kingdom over the decision to leave the European Union and across the waters with our allies has been a deeply problematic period for us. I was on one side of the debate, and I was a very prominent Remainer. But the debate was lost. I do think that the way that Boris Johnson went about executing our exit from the European Union was deeply problematic. We did not secure the best trade deal that we could have done. And worse than that, on leaving the European Union, he could have made a decision to govern for all of us in the United Kingdom, those who voted leave, those who voted remain. But instead, he and Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, all Brexiteers, it continued to sort of prosecute this as if we had not left, and continued not to govern to bring the country back together. It's extraordinary that we have as the UK, no bilateral mechanism for structured dialogue with the European Union at the moment under this government. We have no way of meeting on a regular basis to discuss the challenges of our time, whether it's climate, artificial intelligence, quantum, whatever the issues are, migration. It's extraordinary that this government produced an integrated review 2 years ago. They've just updated it this week, but they produced an integrated review in which they mentioned the EU once in the whole of this foreign policy document. So I want to signal very clearly that yes, we've left the European Union. We will not be re-entering the single market or the customs union under a Labour government. But we absolutely want to get back to structured dialogue with our European partners. We think there are areas that we can work together on. For example, we now have in the UK more students from the whole of China than the whole of the European Union put together studying in our universities. This is extraordinary development. We think we can fix areas like that. We want to be working with our European colleagues on Horizon. That's the science scheme. And we have the review of the trade deal in 2025. So we want to normalize relationships, and we want to build on the deal that Boris Johnson got. I'm really pleased that we have seen progress on the Northern Ireland Protocol. We warned Boris Johnson about the problems that we thought would emerge. Those problems did in fact emerge. We thought the government was dealing with those problems very badly with the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, effectively tearing up the rule of law 2 years after establishing a treaty and undermining the Good Friday Agreement. But we're pleased that Rishi Sunak has finally done what we said you should do, just get on and negotiate. And we've got clearer waters between us and the European Union. But there is much to do. And it's a little bit like what you saw with Joe Biden when he came to the White House, reconnecting with the world, and a different tone after what had gone before. And I think that's the same sort of picture you'd see under a Labour government.
Thank you. Thank you. On the reconnecting point, I wonder if we can move to talking about climate. And where I would hope or assume or guess there are opportunities certainly for the UK with Europe together, but also with the United States, the global South. And I'd particularly be interested in how you rack and stack the challenges on the international climate front, layering in the legislation that we in the United States have passed and you've referenced so eloquently, and maybe even borne down specifically, I noted your reference to a number of critical minerals. And that there is really no country at this point beyond perhaps China, given their head start, that has the ability to produce and supply the necessary minerals that are critical to this energy transition. Where do you see areas of opportunity, whether it's UK and Europe, UK and the global South, working with the United States in this space? And let's hear directly as well where you see some of the challenges that may have come from the legislation that we move forward here in the United States.
So let me just pay huge tribute to Joe Biden and Democratic colleagues for where you have arrived at here in the United States. It's an extraordinary achievement. Inflation reduction at the race to net zero, the global leadership we're taking is extraordinary. And also, might I say, and I say this as a descendant of enslaved people, also to see climate justice as an element of the package, I think is really is a wonderful achievement. And I think it's also to say that this is a moment, and sometimes this gets lost in the news cycle, 24-hour news, Fox News. Just as the United States was instrumental in Fordism after that industrial period, and the white goods, the motor car, the engine of the 20th century really was, the cauldron was here in the United States. It's absolutely fundamental that the United States is central to that race to net zero and the response to the climate emergency and the new technology that will govern our lives. Now, the United States, as such a big landmass with such a large population, is much more self-reliant than many of its Western allies, and certainly than the United Kingdom could potentially be. And therefore, the debate around onshoring and nearshoring and friendshoring is critical for the United States, it would seem to me. Now, the European Union, I think, are in good negotiation with the United States on how we ensure that subsidies and protectionism does not shut out partners in this age where we have to contest with authoritarian powers like China, that at the moment have 90% of the critical supply chain when it comes to renewables. And so it's important that we also include the United Kingdom in relation to ensuring that we're not shutting out progress in business and industry and renewables, solar, hydrogen, nuclear as well in the United Kingdom, that we work together across allies on this issue. But I think that this is a very exciting moment. And I really want to just keep in your mind's eye, and this is a sort of progressives, Keir Starmer in number 10, Joe Biden in the White House, Schultz in Germany, Macron in France, Trudeau in Canada, Albanese in Australia. This is a huge opportunity to make significant progress in the global community. And it's hugely important that that opportunity is grasped and we do all we can to bring it about.
Thank you. Thank you. And I would just say that we at CAP would be eager to continue conversations with folks across Europe on and in the UK on exactly these issues and how we, from outside of government, can help to move things forward in this space. So welcome that opportunity. Let's talk a little bit, if we can, about China. And you mentioned the large number of Chinese students in your universities, outpacing the number of non-British, of European students there. And we've talked about China's control, as you said, 90% of the renewable energy resources. For the United States, our national security strategy has described China as a pacing competitor. I think probably it's the pacing competitor for the United States. Would appreciate your assessment of how the UK is looking at China, at risks and opportunities, at relationships, and your perspective on how the United States is as well.
Well, look, I mean, I think that clearly our response to China should be determined by China. And I think all of us looked with concern last October coming out of their Congress. We've looked, and again in the last week. And what we're seeing is an increased authoritarianism. We're seeing power in the hands of a few. My own view is diversity leads to better decision-making. I'm seeing very few women these days. And a more aggressive posture in the Taiwan Straits. This week, we had the important AUKUS deal and the economic threats to Australia demonstrate the importance of that deal and that partnership between our countries. And we've seen Japan, again, just like Germany, given its history, having to make hard decisions about its own defense spending. They've struck a new partnership with us in the UK and Italy to ensure that they're on the front foot. So this is a period in which we do have to de-risk. It's a period in which we obviously want to continue to cooperate with China on big issues where we can cooperate, climate being a good example of that. We've just come out of a pandemic, but where we will challenge China on issues like human rights, what we see in Xinjiang, and we will compete and we will not make our own economies vulnerable. Now, the UK will continue to ensure that across the European family, these issues are understood, and recognizing that across the European families of nations, there's different exposure economically to China and different risk assessments being made. But I think that Europe is understanding that never again can it find itself as dependent on one nation as has been the case with Russia. And this is a period where we have to de-risk. It would be a huge mistake for European nations to move away from their dependency on Russia only to replace it with a dependency on China.
Thank you. I'm going to follow on your ending on China and Russia with asking you about democratic accountability. And this will be the last question from here, and then we'll go to audience questions for folks. You spoke of the support for the Transatlantic Council. Jeanne Shaheen and Senator Whitehouse, both friends, and we're strong fans. Also curious about how you see the Five Eyes common strategy and platform, how that moves forward in various ways. And I bring this up in the context, obviously, of democratic accountability, of what can we do in our systems and our democracies to hold ourselves more accountable to making sure bad actors don't operate in what one of your former foreign ministers has described as an age of impunity, David Miliband's description of where we are right now.
This is a very important question. There's much I could say here. The first thing to say, I think, is yes, we challenge authoritarianism, but please let us not lose sight within our own democracies of the huge dangers of populism, whether it is coming from the right or the left of the political spectrum. The huge challenges of nativism in our political system. History tells us that when that creeps into democratic systems, empirically, it ends badly, very, very badly. And we have challenged that. My own view is that we need also to, and this is a slight difference of opinion between European colleagues and colleagues here in the United States because of, I think, the your First Amendment, but the regulatory environment around social media is a dimension of this. Misinformation, disinformation is a dimension of this. Interference in our political system is a big dimension of this. And then you get to the problems of dirty money and bad actors in the political system, which is also deeply undermining of democratic norms. I think there's much to learn from each other on these agendas. My own experience, I was first in Washington, I think it was maybe 5 years ago, and senators were raising with me, there'd been a Senate intelligence report confirming concerns about Russian interference in the UK system across political parties. We still have not had our own Russia report implemented. It will fall to a Labour government if we come to power to do that work, and we will do that work to clean up the system. So I'm really pleased that Joe Biden has, launched this democratic initiative to have us in close conversation and dialogue about these issues. I think that work must continue. I would just say this, though, in this new multipolar world with countries like Turkey, India, playing such a fundamental role, and others, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, these middle powers playing an important role, big, powerful new economies like the UAE. It's important that we fight for a world order in which freedoms are protected, but we don't constrain countries that you could not describe as liberal democracies. Nevertheless, they broadly subscribe to the order that we set up in the latter part of the 20th century. So we have also got to include them in the mix. And that links back to the previous question on China, the Belt and Road Initiative. I think we've got to ask ourselves some hard questions about development spend, what the deliverables were for that money. We've got to be really smart about how we go forward with that. An example I give, when I was last here in Washington a few years ago, it wasn't the last time, but the last time I was with CAP in Washington during the pandemic, there was a big debate about the fact that we'd gone on to our second, third shot of the vaccine, and there were African countries who they hadn't even vaccinated 1 or 2% of their populations. And there was a vexed debate between the United States that was more relaxed on international property rules than the European Union and the UK to help countries make that progress. But I believe the real question was, why had we not used our science capability to give Africa the manufacturing capacity to produce its own vaccines? That's smart power. That's development. And we need to get serious about that over this next period, where to compete with China's Belt and Road.
Terrific and important note to conclude this part of the discussion with. Questions from folks? Let's go to this gentleman here. And could you just, when you stand up, just identify yourself? Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Hello. First of all, welcome to DC. And I'm glad you mentioned Africa, because I was quite, I'm Carl van Barton. I represent the Somali government here in DC and different agencies. I mostly lobby on human rights issues. And so also, again, I'm the Republican Party chairman in DC. So I'm the fox in the hen house today. Quick question, 2 questions, hope you don't mind. I get from a lot of African governments to know that the UK and the US is one rule for Europe and one rule for Africa. Example, Somalia. Northern Somalia, you have Somaliland trying to break away. There's a British oil company there drilling for oil. The Somali government says you should go away. They're still there. Now, this is a British company, in Somaliland against the Somali government's request to leave. This is not the 1800s where you can just do what you want to do. But there's been no response from the British government. And that's my first question. My second question right now has to do again with lesser knows that's currently happening.
Can we keep it to one question only, because we have limited time?
Yeah. So my first question is, as shadow secretary, and if you become foreign secretary in the future, what do you intend to do to ensure that we don't have one rule for Africa and one rule for Europe in Somalia?
Sure. Great. The gentleman in the back here. And again, please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Thank you again. My name is Bassam Barabandi, Syrian, live in DC. My question, again, back to the same where you end up. The Russian, when they look in the world, they look as one theater against the West. So Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Algeria, Iran, it's for the Russian, they are one front. Whereas for the West, we feel it's 3-4 different fronts. Do you think UK can change that? Thank you.
And we're going to take one online question at the same time, so we'll just pull them all together given our tight time here. Laura?
Yes. Given that there is an election coming up in the UK.
I think a little louder.
Given that there is an election coming up in the UK, can you please share what you believe are the main political domestic issues the UK is facing and what you think the road to the next election looks like?
Great questions. Look, I'm not going to suggest that the Western Alliance has got everything right over my 50 years on the planet, and certainly before that. You know, I said I'm the descendant of enslaved people. I know that to be true. But I do, because of the imperialism that enslaved my ancestors, I think that fight for freedom is a fight that we've got to win. And when I look at China, Russia, Iran, and the tyranny that is represented in parts of that coalition, you know, it's really clear what side of the argument you need to be on. Now, we need to do better. And I don't think, by the way, that the way we handled the COVID vaccine was a high point. I think the global South saw this. And so we then bounce into the Ukraine war. And it is still the case, despite the votes at the United Nations, that the votes against or the abstains represent a greater proportion of humanity than the votes condemning Russian aggression. And we have to keep that in mind. So I think we will have to be smart. We have to be thoughtful. We have to reflect a bit harder, I think, on how we're using development spend, particularly in the context of food crisis, climate, migration, conflict, driving greater challenges across much of Africa particularly. But I do think that at a time when I think 73 of the poorest countries in the world, their first debtor is China, I think that potentially that's a problem for them in an age where we ought to be seeing less debt, in fact, not more. So thank you for that question. Look, I think that clearly one of the challenges for democratic countries is the election cycle. I mean, it's the virtue, but it's the challenge. When more authoritarian powers play this sort of much longer game, much longer. And so the real optimism I have at this moment is how united we have been on the issue of Ukraine. We must not let the election cycle unpick that united front. We really must. And that's the key thing, I would say, at this point in time. In the UK, the number one issue that the British public are raising is the economy. In a sense, I think it was an American leader that said it's the economy, stupid. And that norm may well be returning. They are also raising our healthcare system. Coming out of the pandemic, our healthcare is in tatters. The great National Health Service is not functioning at its best. Education, is a big issue. The mental health crisis amongst young people, the catch-up that's not going on, bloated class sizes is a big issue. They're raising crime. Both our countries are experiencing increased crime coming out of the pandemic. And of course, the race to net zero remains an important issue. We have to translate that to jobs. We have a plan to translate that to jobs. Look, Rishi Sunak is an improvement on Liz Truss, but you saw how low the bar was. But he has an incredibly divided party. That's got some real kind of ideological purists in it. It's sort of puritanical and deeply problematic. So we are ahead in the polls. We can't be complacent about that because we lost the election by such a large number last time around that you know, even on the poll numbers, our majority would not be huge. So we're not complacent. There's a lot to fight for, but we do have a moment where we mustn't drop the ball. And obviously also we've seen fortunes change in Scotland where Nicola Sturgeon has stepped back. And that, again, I don't want to overstate this, but it also presents an opportunity for Labour to present its message in Scotland again. And on the whole, if we're forming a government, we're winning in Scotland again. So watch this space. I think the election will be in the latter part of 2024. So you might not be watching because you'll have your own election as well. Yeah.
We will be watching. Here at CAP, we will be watching for sure, even as we watch at home. There are so many elections around the world that are critical, and all the concerns you mentioned on accountability in the previous comment also go to those. I know we are at time, sadly and unfortunately, but I also know that everyone here and everyone online joins me in thanking you, Mr. Lammy, for spending this time with us. And also, I hope you know this already, but we would love to have CAP be your home away from home. And that anytime that you're back here, you are welcome to our stage and our rooms and our discussion. We learned so much from you. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Really appreciate that.